now, without further ado, let me introduce our guest for today. For today's topic, the topic today is Taking Back the Culture, and our guest is Francois Crodel. And I've known Francois for some years now through Tea Party activities. Francois was born in Washington, D.C. He has bachelor's degrees in political science and French literature from Washington and Lee University, and a master's in political economy from George Mason University. His master's thesis examined the political philosophies that informed America's founding fathers. He has worked for various trade groups in Washington and spent several years with the federal government. In his younger days, he was on the hard left. He has been active in the Tea Party movement since 2010. He's currently working on a project to take back the left's dominance of the civil society. Now, today's topic is taking back the culture, but before we dive into that, Francois, as I mentioned, I've known you for some years, and what's really distinctive about you is that you were formerly on the hard left and you worked in some radical left-wing groups. So I thought we would start out today by you telling the audience a little bit about that experience and your migration from left to right, or left to non-left, however you want to characterize it, and also talk about some things you learned by being on the left for those years.
Oh, sure. Thanks a lot, Chris. Yeah, so having grown up in Washington, D.C., both my parents came from small towns, and nonetheless, growing up in D.C., you can't help. First off, Washington, D.C., for those of you who don't live in the region, Washington, D.C. is a one business town, and that's politics. And you got the federal government, and you got Capitol Hill. So from very young, you're exposed to politics. And growing up as well in a big city, cultured and international, you can't help through the schooling, and everyone you know everyone is left-wing, has a very left-wing view. And so that's how I grew up and marinated in that. And so when I had I became a bit idealistic when I was in my adolescent years, and of course migrated to the left because that was perceived culturally that that's the morally superior viewpoint and how to view the world, and those who are resisting a more left-wing progressive agenda are morally backward. And so I joined a few environmental groups, Greenpeace, and I joined Friends of the Earth, and I worked with them. I was interning with them and so forth. And then little bit by little, starting in my late 20s, mid to late 20s, I already started to ask questions. I did start off as an engineering major, and I think that saved me somewhat. Started asking a lot of questions because I grew up right next to the ghetto, knew a lot of friends who were in the ghetto, and I started seeing what I saw on the ground did not match what I saw in the local news or everything I was told. So I started asking questions little by little, and it was a very slow process, and I finally left the left. I saw there was a big disconnect between what I was being told and what I saw on the ground. And I said, these policies are not helping people, they're hurting people.
Well, I guess that makes you a walkaway before walkaway was cool. You mentioned morally superior and morally backward. You and I have explored this topic in conversation a bit, and can you tell me just a little bit before we dive into the main topic, how the left operates on this plane of moral superiority and how they're vulnerable for making such claims?
Well, I'm going to digress a little bit. You say how they operate. Well, I remember how I used to think, and the difference between the left and the right is it was almost a quasi-religious view, is that we wanted to get our views to be dominant in society. We wanted to convert. And so we want to get everyone into environmental issues. And so you would constantly talk with people and try to convince people, the general public, of the righteousness of our views. So that's something I saw. And I think by not countering that, and that's something we can discuss later, is where the right doesn't get involved, is this long term. They look into the long term, and they are in a little bit of a cocoon, and I think that's a weakness. The left doesn't hear other contrary views of how to make the world a better place. There's other ways of making the world a better place. This is what I thought. I haven't changed completely. I would say I'm still believe in a better world, or you can't make a perfect world. I don't believe in utopianism, but the way that the left approaches things is it's vulnerable to someone coming in and say, no, this is a different way of making the world better.
Well, you mentioned that people are not hearing contrary views these days. The way I look at it, the left has succeeded very well in making their views ubiquitous and shutting out other views, so people aren't hearing them anymore. And I think this is going to segue nicely into our main topic. And to begin that discussion, it's often observed that politics is downstream from culture, or as you have put it, culture drives politics, not the other way around. Whoever owns the culture owns the politics. So why don't we launch our main discussion today, and let's hear from you on that point.
Well, I think that's something I say to myself, well, how did I become someone on the left? And, it's just, you get it from everywhere. You get it at the school, your teachers, you get it in your school books, you get from your, the fellow families in your neighborhood. You get the local newspaper. The Washington Post was the dominant source of news. Of course, the local news channels as well. They would, chime in. And back in those days, I'm back in the 80s and late 70s. You see all your sources of information on television. Everyone is espousing a left-wing view. Then you have the arts and entertainment, the art field. Everyone who gets involved in art, they as well always have left-wing views and approaches, and how they, through a prism of the left, and through theater as well. And so all our books, not just textbooks, history books, but in novels, and going back even 100, 200 years. So, when I left, I guess when I got angry is I saw, well, how did I become the left? Because you get fed everywhere. And when I changed over, one thing I noticed is that the right is not as sensitive to that. That's how you become on the left. It's a complete immersion in it.
Total immersion. That's a good way to put it. Now, you talked about how the arts also have been co-opted by the left. So it's not only the media, the newspapers, the television, it's Hollywood, it's the book publishers, but also the art world. If you take something like Angels in America, which was a play that made a big splash 20 years ago. And so it got so much publicity, I decided to read it. And it was all about how Joe McCarthy was wrong, and it was blasting Roy Cohn, who had worked with McCarthy for a while. I'm forgetting the fine points. But the point is, here was something that was supposedly artistic, and yet it was just from front to back, it was just more left-wing drivel. You can't escape this stuff now.
Oh, it's been going on to me, who likes old movies, you can already see the beginnings of it in the 1930s, where Hollywood was completely all in for the New Deal, which was a completely contrary to the founders' vision, completely contrary to the U.S. Constitution, but they were all in. And as the decades continued, the movies kept on becoming more and more left. And also, one part of this is they try to show, especially starting in the 70s when I was very, very young, they make it, only the cool people are on the left. And the right is always, portrayed and caricaturized as just being bumbling idiots and backward and so forth, and basically morally twisted people, and that's all you get to see. So yeah, that's what all people, when you get your entertainment, that's the caricature you get.
Well, another aspect of making their views ubiquitous, so in total immersion, you can't escape them, is I wonder if you've run into this. I've run into it at our booths for Potomac Tea Party. So you begin to, you're talking to somebody from the left, because that's who lives around here, this area, and they say, well, what have you got to say? And then you say what you say, and they'll say, their immediate question is, well, where'd you hear that? What's your source for that? And so you could say whatever source it is. You could even say the Wall Street Journal, and the immediate response is, that's not a credible source. So I wonder if it's a game, it's a stock line. I wonder if you've run into that.
Well, yeah, when you're marinated in a certain worldview, and it's been validated constantly through every source possible for many decades, when you hear something contrary, you're going to be extremely skeptical. And so, if I were on the left and I had never switched over, and I heard you say the same thing, I would say, that's some crazy talk, and I would not, I would discount it because it would be not credible,
Well, I had an experience that backs that up. About 6 months ago, I was with a group of liberals. It was a stock investment club, and they were talking about how it was all Russia collusion and Trump this and Trump that. And I was following that story early on, so I started talking about the fact that the unmasking by Susan Rice seemed to exceed the guidelines, and that there had been leaks by people in the FBI, and that a lot of this seemed to have been orchestrated by Barack Obama. And so all of this stuff is hitting the news now. But 6 months ago, in talking to this group of people, they had never heard any of it, and they were extremely skeptical. They didn't. I could see I wasn't even making a dent, and that's the beauty of this machine they've created. By you make everything ubiquitous, total immersion, it's really hard to break through it.
Well, since they're dominant, culturally dominant, it dominance by itself almost imposes a certain legitimacy, And so when you get someone who's contrary to that, if you're not dominant, you're considered outside the mainstream ideas and thoughts. So immediately, it gives anyone who tries to break in, they're on the defensive.
They are. And you also use the word progressive, and you and I have talked about it. Actually, you put me on this. There are points where you can construct your argument to counter that very effectively. So they've captured this language about being forward-thinking and progressive and whatnot. And I think one of your favorite approaches is to talk about how, no, they're not progressive, they're regressive. They're actually a throwback to way back when. So if you could give an example or two of that.
Oh, well, the left, again, thinks that their policy approaches are going to help people, and that it's going to improve the lives of people and so forth. And they never count in what the cost that it takes to do what they want. And I try to whenever I have a discussion, I try to just tell them about whether it's a minimum wage. I said, first off, you've got to you have to intrude on the rights of say businessmen. You have to intrude on their rights and to set the prices for labor. And I said, number two, it's price fixing. So now government's involved with price fixing and setting pricing. And then I said, what it ends up doing when you make something more expensive, people buy less of it. So so I point out as well that it's going to increase unemployment. And so when I point out all the terrible things that it's going to do, intruding on basic rights and so forth, it causes pause. I get them to pause.
The great advance in political philosophy was, and you know, this from your graduate studies, was classical liberalism, and the idea that there are individual rights and that the people are sovereign. In one way, I think of the left, I think of them as a throwback. That was the revolution. I think of the left as a throwback to times before then, when the king was sovereign, a ruler was sovereign over the people. And so that's writ large. I view the entire left as being regressive rather than progressive.
Oh, I agree. I always try to show how the policies attack not only individual rights, but all the negative impacts that it's going to do, and how it authorizes more control of government and encourages abuse, or invites abuse.
Another insight that I have found very powerful from you is this notion that they think they're morally superior. And once you pointed that out to me, I began to watch for that, and I've seen it on a number of occasions. And so here today, you mentioned minimum wage is actually a form of price fixing by the government. So that leaves them vulnerable to an attack. How is it moral for the government to fix prices? So I've been able to use this question: how is it moral? When the Red Hen episode occurred with Sarah Huckabee Sanders, and the restaurant people, that family was saying they were morally superior because they refused to serve somebody from the Trump administration. So I began to think along these lines that this great insight you had about moral superiority. So I began to ask questions like, well, how is it moral to cause somebody to be in fear of their life to such an extent they have to have Secret Service protection? How is it moral? And the same thing with the Virginia governor. He was talking about the Medicaid expansion was the moral thing to do. Well, Governor, how is it moral to make disabled people, the original beneficiaries of Medicaid, how is it moral to make them wait in the back of the line while childless, able-bodied adults get to go to the front of the line? So I think they're very vulnerable on this through this approach, which you have labeled moral jujitsu.
Chris, you're turning into a leftist, but in the good way. On our side, you're thinking of a leftist, but you're now using it on the right. So very good.
Think like a leftist. Yeah, you got to. Who was it? Sun Tzu said you got to know your enemy. So that's what I'm trying to do. But let's get back to your first point here. Culture drives politics, not the other way around. Whoever owns the culture owns the politics. Before we get into taking back the culture, if you could give a couple of examples of how there's a direct link, a direct line from the left owning the culture, especially, for example, the pop culture, and the popularity of a political position.
Well, it's politics ultimately is a public relation, and that things have changed in the last 200 years now that this new thing called democracy or mass democracy, and so you can move crowds, and the left has mastered that, and you can change issues, and if you can capture the culture, you can change perception, because at the end of the day, in politics, perception is reality. And so, however you feel about gay marriage, for example, the left has done a brilliant job, within 40 or 50 years of completely having homosexuality and say gay marriage, homosexual marriage, completely acceptable. And and they did that through the culture. They just completely accepting it. You see that over and over again. They made the moral case for it. They portrayed those who are in favor of it in our entertainment and news and so forth as morally advanced and enlightened, and anybody who's opposed in any way is somehow a backward thinking or characterized or portrayed in any way, whether it's, like I said, whether it can be the news, and I expand culture and include even the news, our sources of news, in that way.
That's a good example. They started out by changing perceptions, changing attitudes, and then it translated very directly. I read up on this. They had quite a strategy going for decades, and they did it incrementally with various policy proposals. But finally, it all culminated in a Supreme Court case, and they didn't take it there until they thought the polling numbers had shifted enough that the court would be on their side. And lo and behold, go ahead.
To me, it was such a complete, total victory. You have a legal background, so you can correct me, but I remember in my arguments and in my critique of Roe versus Wade, when the court intervened at the national level in the abortion issue, and for decades the right complained that the court overstepped its bounds, and it should have been at the state's level, which is what I agree with. It should be a bottom-up change. And here you have something that's top-down. And I thought, that there was vowed never again are we ever going to allow some big cultural change, especially on this, something along these lines, to happen again. Well, that's exactly what happened was it 2012 or 2013 when the Supreme Court got involved with the homosexual, and they just declared, the states weren't involved. To me, it was Roe v. Wade the second, and this time, those who were against homosexual marriage, you didn't hear a peep. It was the victory, the cultural victory by the left over so many decades was so complete. There's nothing left to do.
The cultural victory. This is why the Supreme Court probably felt comfortable declaring it as a fundamental right. You contrast that with Brown versus Board of Education in 1954 or whenever it was. And there, the Supreme Court was way out ahead of society in terms of school desegregation. And you didn't hear anything out of the Supreme Court again for another 10 years, at which point they said, well, this needs to proceed with all deliberate speed. And things never really went well for school desegregation. And it just, the whole issue just sort of got fought to a standstill, a stalemate. And that's what happened to that issue. You contrast that with what happened with gay marriage. It was still ended up being a top-down decision, a top-down cram down from Washington, instead of being true organic social change, bottom-up from the states. There was some of that in preparation, but the point is, it was still. We're veering off into another subject, but it was still a top-down decision from the Supreme Court when the system is not supposed to work that way. A declaration of a fundamental right. I think the Supreme Court should get out of that business, which is the social engineering business.
I agree.
Well, let's talk about one more issue where attitudes are changing, and not in a good way, and especially among young people, and this is with respect to democratic socialism. It polls very well now, to the point where, especially among young people, socialism will poll better than capitalism. There's some specific reasons for that. That generation is burdened by student debt, there was the formative experience for them was the financial crisis of 2008. So they are growing up in a time when confidence in capitalism was running at a low, but still is kind of curious to me that they like socialism, but some of them are in financial trouble because of a socialistic style program, which was the government taking over student loans and pushing the student loans and pushing tuition up and creating a whole machine there where it says we're going to make everything very expensive, but we'll help you. That's one of the things, machines that the left creates. So talk to me about how the culture is shifting on this question of socialism.
Well, socialism is, you hear that, I'm no longer in school, but, they start in school. I have friends who have children I can already see, and I've noticed this even in the last 15, 20 years, more and more, even kids shows already at street for kids 3, 4, 5, even 3, 4, 5 years of age. They're already insinuating and pushing in, inserting left-wing neo-Marxist views, and so the children are being indoctrinated in this. And most people, most human beings, and this is going back even going back to ancient Greece when it was involved with democracy, is that most human beings, unlike like you and me, Chris, who are really interested in these topics, but most people, all they want to do is they spend the day, they do their gardening, or they pick up their kids from school, and they fire up the grill for the weekend, and they watch a sports game. In other words, they don't follow politics much, and so they just go wherever the culture takes them. And so if the culture that moves in one direction, they just go with it. And there's an idea of consensus bias. If you hear all your friends and all your sources, and everyone is around you telling you, Chris, that this is the right thing to do, you're going to start bending, and that's almost a very human thing to happen. So these young people, they're getting it from everywhere, and the parents, how many people, they're just, I guess a lot of people, when you see that there's such a cultural dominance, how can you go against it? You just go with the flow, and so the kids grow up. You have the teachers who are completely convinced, and they have explanations in their own twisted way. And I had a little bit of that when I was growing up a little bit, but I think things have gotten worse. I took a couple of my classes over at George Mason. I got a little sense of that. And so, the kids now, this is the triumph. The left is reaping the fruits of its labors after many decades of getting themselves in the arts and entertainment industry and in the newsroom and so forth, and in academia from kindergarten all the way up to law school. They're reaping the benefits, and as it's almost like a snowball. The more dominance you have, the more sources it comes in, the more people are going to be even more influenced, because it serves as legitimacy. So now you have these kids, like you said, they're getting it from very, very young, and from everywhere. Even, like I said, even for little cartoons, at 3, 4 years old, you're already being force-fed this stuff. So when you come out at 20 years old, 22, this is what ends up.
Well, you're right to be concerned by this early indoctrination. I remember almost 30 years ago now, going over and visiting my sister in Annapolis, and she had 3 kids. And one time I went over there and I picked up this literature they had hanging around. It was all about environmentalism, this and green that, and polar bears and all the rest of it. And it was kids stuff. It was directed at kids who were 4, 5, and 6. And I'm thinking, wow, well, this is really interesting. What's this about? And 2 of my nephews, I have a nephew and a niece who both grew up to be environmental scientists. So you're quite right to be concerned about indoctrination even at that early age. Now, one concern I have is I found my way back. I did the typical college kid left to right thing. I voted for George McGovern, who was the Bernie Sanders of the day. And then Jimmy Carter, who was a Democrat, and then I voted for Ronald Reagan twice and never looked back. My politics have been stable for 35, coming up on 40 years now. So, but I could find my way back. There were breadcrumbs that had been planted in my childhood, a lot of anti-communist talk and things like that. What concerns me now is you say the left has succeeded in so well informing the narrative and the total immersion technique that they're picking up the breadcrumbs. People aren't going to find their way back.
Oh, I agree.
Well, in the time remaining, let's talk a little bit about the narrative, shaping the narrative, and then let's get into your recommendations for how to take back the culture, how to begin taking it back. So you say here that in politics, perception is a reality, as you've mentioned here today. Perception is formed by the narrative, and the narrative is formed by culture. So tell us your thinking on those points.
Well, again, as I was mentioning about how people pick up ideas, you more a fundamental. We'll go back to the fundamentals. Where do you get your values? How do you see the world? And it's the values that you pick up. People that you admire, like here in Washington D.C. We like to think of ourselves as a highly educated group of people, high IQ, well cultured. And if you look around you, all the well-cultured, high-intelligence people, they all believe in left-wing views, and so it provides, there's a little bit of a snobbery there. It flatters people. We all want to be the above average, and so we get indoctrinated in that way. So the culture, that's how it forms us. And how we move through the system is those who we see who are above us have a certain ways of views, and if those people above us, we want to emulate them, and we see them as standard in academia. And if you're someone who considers yourself an intellectual or someone who reveres education, you look at what the highly educated people do and say and think, and if they all think left wing, you're going to go that way. And I see that when I'm growing up in D.C., that was almost given almost a smug sense of intellectual arrogance and confidence that, you're part on the winning side. You're part of the elite. You know more than what the average person. You're above it all. And that's how you get influenced in every way. You see people, the movers and shakers.
Kim Kennedy started this project, Conversations on the Culture, with an eye towards activism, that every conversation would promote some kind of action on the part, stimulate some kind of action on the part of the audience. So what are your recommendations for beginning to rectify all this?
Well, Chris, you and I have had conversations, and I'm as you know, I'm very, very, very critical of the right, and on this very issue, and not understanding the situation we're in. One thing I noticed is the difference between going from the left to the right. I remember when I had just started to convert over, and I wanted to get involved with some conservative group, and I was already inherently aware that, when I changed over, I was so angry. I said, everything I was told all my life was a big lie. And it came from so many sources. So I had this already innate sense that the big lie is ubiquitous and we have to change it. We have to wake people up, the mass society. And I remember when I called up, the very first time I called up someone, I spoke to someone over the phone, and I said, well, how are we going to get our ideas out there? And the person on the other side of the phone says, oh, we don't do that. We're just going to try to take up, get voter participation. We're trying to get out the vote. I said, well, that's nice and well, but what about the long term? How do we get our ideas in the local region, for example? How do we get that out there and change? And so basically we don't do that. And since that time, I've always had that issue with the right, is that one big difference is they understand that politics is all about a game of perception, and the culture, dealing with culture, it's a long game. The right always goes, I've noticed, is always very short-term oriented. They go no more than one election ahead, if that much, and that's pretty extreme, it seems to me, for them. Whereas the left, yes, they have a short-term game, but they also have a long-term game. And in dealing with my project, the phrase is social change. When I was with the environmental groups, that's what we were about. We were going to change. We're going to wake people up, and in trying to bring knowledge or enlightenment to people. Don't they realize that such and such issue is so vitally important? And we wanted to get everybody on board with us. And so so they think in long term. And you do that through the culture. Cultural change Obama, when he came in, politics, structural changes that have occurred in society over the previous 10, 15, 20 years. So Obama, and he you know, that's the final of hard work of taking over Hollywood, taking over the news, all aspects of news and academia and so forth, and that's what you get. And so the recommendation is that, you know, you have to think the big game. There's every day you have to, for the short term, is change perception. Go on the attack. Get out there. Don't let the left take control of the narrative. We just have this now with Kavanaugh. Again, this is a brilliant decision, a public relations maneuver by the left. Last minute, Dianne Feinstein was sitting on this accuser for a Supreme Court nominee, Kavanaugh, and at the last second they throw the bombshell out there. What do they say? If the right, the Republicans and the conservatives don't say anything, he will always be tainted. And so immediately, brilliant subliminal messaging, public relations warfare. They're geniuses at it. Our side rarely ever engages in that. And for the long term, I would say that we need to get into the culture game. And for that, that's very difficult. That's going to take decades before you start seeing fruit. And I don't know how conservatives are going to handle that. But that means we have to become cultural generators, starting our own movie studios or producing content and not targeting other conservatives. That's not the point. We have to talk, we target the mainstream bulk of society. We have to get into the social change. How do we get our ideas dominant, socially dominant, and culturally dominant? So that means targeting the mainstream, and that means getting into the arts, the entertainment. That means news. How do we get our sources of news targeted not just to other conservatives, but to the mainstream? How do we get our art and entertainment to the mainstream, and so on and so forth?
Well, you're quite right. I like about the left playing a long game, and they're brilliant at it. They've been doing this for decades, honing their skills. So I like to say our side has great ideas and terrible strategies and tactics. And the other side has terrible ideas and great strategies and tactics. They've been at it so long. And there's a book I would recommend. I don't know if you've read this book, Francois. It's called A Conservative History of the American Left. It's by Daniel Flynn. And it shows you that these people have been at it for 200 years. They started attacking marriage and the family 200 years ago, and then it went on from there. It's one of the most influential books that I've ever read. So, yeah. Are you familiar with that book?
Yeah, well, when we last spoke, I got it over eBay for like $3, and I got it last week. But I'm reading Liberal Fascism right now about the left dominance in the early 20th century, first half or the first quarter. So I'm reading that right now. But if you talk about at that time, they were the left. We're talking about intellectual dominance in the 1920s and 30s in economics professions or in academia. All who were enlightened and educated, they were all some sort of socialism is the future, some form of it. Whether it's the socialism that was being practiced in Italy, whether it was practiced in Germany or in Russia. And Wilson and our dear friend FDR and tried to emulate them. They were part of that movement, and so they were culturally dominant at that time. And unfortunately, their ideas here in the American experiment, they're still dominant. The repercussions to this day.
Repercussions to this day of Keynesian economics. You're right. That's still, they don't call it that anymore, but it's still the big government, central planning. Let's do deficit spending to stimulate the economy. All that stuff is still dominant thinking in Washington in terms of economics. I've read several critiques of Keynesian economics. It just completely shreds it so that there's nothing left. It's bogus. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't work the way it's supposed to. it worked the way it was supposed to, then we should be having, in the Obama years when they were running the $1 trillion deficits, we should have had a rip-roaring economy, and we didn't. And conversely, in England, where they should have had, well, I've lost my point, but anyway, it just doesn't hold up to real world scrutiny, but it's still the dominant school of economic thought. You are also quite right about the people thinking short term on our side of the ledger. I can't tell you the number of people I ran into after the election when Trump got elected who said, well, everything's fine now. Trump got elected. We don't have to worry about anything. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, that's so short-sighted. You just have no concept of what's going on here. As I say, the left's been at this for 200 years. We're about to wrap up, but before we do that, do you have any last thoughts on anything that was said here today, or additional recommendations, perhaps a concrete action step that people in the audience could take on their own or take to their groups so that we can begin to reverse this process?
Well, I think, for short term, is start getting into the, trying to get local groups getting into the public relations war. One thing I would like to do, and maybe Chris, we can do that here in the DC area, is to put the whole point we need to do is put the left on the moral defensive. And you just can't do it once in a while. A defensive warfare, you lose. And if you learn that in the military, you lose over the long term. The best defense is a good offense. And the left has been on offense for several decades. And the right doesn't engage. And we need to have a new generation of those on the right who are willing to understand politics for what it is, and put the left. And so, for example, and this is just simply an idea, is and the mainstream right doesn't want to get involved with this for some reason, is say school choice and say school vouchers and so forth. Well, how many local county educators or council members on their county board they don't allow any bills to come forth for school choice and so forth, but they send their kids, they personally send their kids to, say, a private school, a non-government school. That's a great way to show the hypocrisy. Look at Obama. He sent his two children to Washington, D.C.'s most most elitist school, high school, which is called Sidwell Friends. No one called them out on it. That gross hypocrisy. And to show the left, to show the mainstream America that the left are charlatans. We never do that, but we need to do that. We need to discredit them. And that's something you can do and we discussed this earlier, is about showing the harm of the harm of that left-wing policies make. The people who are harmed, and show the martyrs, the people who are harmed by tax codes, small businessmen, in all issues, whether it's illegal immigration and so forth, to highlight and bring it to public attention. That this is what you're doing, you, Mr. Left Wing. This is the harm that you're doing. These are the lives that you're impacting, obviously in a negative way.
Their policies do hurt people, and we should make more of a point of that. School choice can be a winning issue for us. What parent is satisfied with the performance of the public schools, and that cuts across all demographic groups. So there should be a way that we can pick up support on that issue. We also have other winning issues. We have the Second Amendment that's very popular. We should defend that to the hilt. We have property rights. When the constitutional amendment here in Virginia passed 4 or 5 years ago, it passed with 75% of the vote. When's the last time you saw 75% of the vote for anything? So property rights are very, very popular. We do have winning issues, and we should be banging on them more. In closing, I guess I would say that your conversation and your insights here today should show people that the things that are happening are not by accident. They're by design. The left's been working at this for a long time. Hats off. They're masters at strategy. And we have an American idea. We have to defend the American idea, or it will get perverted or subverted or thrown away. So it's up to us. and this is an implicit value of Potomac Tea Party. We have an implicit core value of citizen engagement. Republics don't run themselves. They were never meant to. They can't possibly run themselves. The whole essence of a republic is that people are self-governing and the people are sovereign. So we need to start acting like it. And that pretty much closes out what I would want to say. Any last words from you, Francois, before we bid everyone adieu?
We need to take the battle to the enemy. That's all I have to say.
Very good. And with that, we'll close it out. And that's today's Conversations on the Culture. See you next time, and Kim will be back then.